President Trump is threatening to revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status. The Trump administration froze more than $2 billion in federal funding to the university earlier this week when it defied his administration's demands to limit activism on campus. Nearly $9 billion in federal funding is still at stake. A Harvard law professor tells ABC News this could wind up in court, saying Harvard has a strong legal position because of protections from the First Amendment and Civil Rights Act. So let's bring in senior reporter for the Harvard Crimson, Dhruv Patel, for more. Dhruv, thank you for being with us today. What's the mood like on campus and at that student-run newspaper as this fight escalates?
It's a busy time at the Crimson for us to cover what's really proving to be a historic moment in Harvard's history. But I would say students and faculty are largely impressed and celebratory about what has happened over the last 2 days. When President Garber decided to defy the Trump administration's demands on Monday, it was really a historic moment, right? He did exactly what students and faculty had been urging him to do for the last few weeks and frankly, since January 20th. Students and faculty have protested, calling on Garber and Harvard's governing bodies to stand up to the White House. And when Garber decided to do that on Monday, a lot of students and faculty saw that as a win in their books. There was a protest on Saturday where they called him to do exactly that. 500 Harvard affiliates got together to protest what they called Trump's fascist demands. So for a lot of those students and faculty, they're saying that, hey, I protested on Saturday. You listened to me on Monday. Seems like you responded to the demonstrations that we've been having on campus. But largely the sentiment is one of things, excitement, but also anxiety over the fact that $2.2 billion in funding has been paused, and the implications of that are yet to be seen.
In one sense, there's nothing new necessarily about telling universities that they're too left-leaning. It's kind of always been the case. We have a similar conversation in the UK, by the way, about liberal universities. The issue here is about freedom of speech and blocking people who have more conservative views. Do the Trump administration have a point? Are universities like yours not allowing conservative voices on campus?
Look, I think what's most important to note about this entire situation is that there's two ways to think about it, right? The first set of demands that Harvard was issued came 2 weeks ago. And frankly, they weren't very descriptive, right? We're talking a 2-page letter that had a few bullet points, but President Garber's response to that letter was, hey, we acknowledge that anti-Semitism is real. We acknowledge that anti-Semitism is present, and we're going to work with the federal government to address these issues, just like the ones that you brought up. But when the Trump administration issued a new set of demands on Friday, it was much lengthier, right? We're talking a 5-page letter where there were new sets of demands issued, including, hey, if an international student breaks the code of conduct at Harvard, they need to be immediately reported to federal agencies. Hey, Trump needs to have the authority to be able to review what Harvard does on an annual basis for at least the next 4 years. And so what Garber and Harvard are saying in this moment is that, hey, this isn't just an issue right now of anti-Semitism. It isn't just an issue of normal academic issues. It's really a matter of the Trump administration being coercive and going beyond federal authority and demanding a different set of demands that really align with their agenda as opposed to what exactly anti-Semitism would involve. That's what Garber is saying. That's what the message was in his Monday email to Harvard affiliates. And it's still an open question of where the university will take this campaign.
So if Harvard loses its tax-exempt status and some funding dries up, what actual impact would that have on the student body?
That's a fantastic question. And look, I think the most important thing to note here is if Harvard was to lose its tax-exempt status, it would fundamentally change how Harvard would need to pay its taxes. It would put a lot of federal funding and a lot of funding that the university has more broadly at risk. I would say the most immediate consequences of what that move may have is really to research. Right? There's a lot of important research that's being done at the Harvard Medical School, at the Harvard School of Public Health, at the Harvard Dental School. And a lot of that research really relies on large-scale grants and contracts. And what we're seeing already is that stop work orders have been issued. And really, if tax-exempt status is lifted and Harvard has to pay additional money in taxes, the immediate consequence may be is that certain research projects may be halted. That's the messaging that Harvard is also pushing for in a media blitz on Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms shortly after Garber's email. But I think research will be the most primary consequence of any of these changes, whether it's an endowment tax, whether it's the change in tax-exempt status, or really what we saw on Monday with the funding pause.
Senior reporter for the Harvard Crimson, Dhruv Patel, thanks very much for joining us. We've got ABC News political director Avery Harper here, which is great. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You heard Dhruv talking about the impact it's going to have on funding for research. Obviously, university is a huge research centre, so that would have an impact. Can we just rewind slightly here? Because this kind of started, I think, with the resignation of the president because of anti-Semitism claims. So how do we get here?
Listen, I would even argue that it started way before that. I mean, conservatives have long been trying to call attention to what it believes is the censorship of conservative voices on college campuses. And then you fast forward to those hearings that we saw with all those university presidents on Capitol Hill. And again, another instance of conservatives leading the charge, calling into question the culture of the universities and the leadership of these universities. And now we see the Trump administration really trying to use federal funding to strong arm these universities, prestigious universities, into submission. And Harvard is standing firm as one of the most prestigious universities in all of the world.
So they're also citing anti-Semitism in the immigration crackdown. There's kind of a lot of themes here. They're kind of saying that these students have no right to be in the country if they're going to go on these protests. I mean, there seems to be quite a lot of overlap. How are they defining who they're going on?
Well, I would argue that their demands are actually quite broad. It's broader than just speaking to, and we saw the student from the Harvard Crimson mention reporting students to federal authorities if they break the code of conduct. But this was also about limiting the ability for students and for staffers and professors to have and be able to weigh in on university affairs. It's also about bringing in some sort of outside party to determine if the content of coursework at Harvard was diverse in terms of perspective. And this all comes amid the Trump administration's real attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And so we're seeing Harvard say that, look, the people that it hires, the students it admits, and the content of its coursework is just not up for federal approval.
Yeah, defining anti-Semitism, defining free speech, drawing a line between those two. A lot of this stuff is getting blurred. We had New York Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. She's proposing this bill to pull tax-exempt status from universities that promote anti-Semitism, in her words. I want to play some of what she said yesterday on Fox News. Have a listen.
President Trump made the direct and correct decision to defund to the tune of over $2 billion these higher ed institutions that have fundamentally lost their way. U.S. taxpayer dollars should never be propping up anti-Semitism.
So is this conservative ideology, or is this about trying to combat hate?
I think there are a lot of folks who are on college campuses that might identify this sort of messaging as a conservative ideology. You know, Linsey Davis, she's an alum of Harvard, and she's sort of led the charge in trying to hold some of these universities accountable. I think for those who are on campuses and for the leadership of universities across this country, there's going to have to be a conversation about how it either tries to withstand these threats from Republicans in Washington, from the Trump administration, or how it will somehow find some other source of funding in order to push forward on their initiatives.
And Harvard could afford this in some sense, but lots of other
universities just don't have the endowment that Harvard has.
Meanwhile, President Biden, he's been speaking for the first time since leaving office, criticizing the administration as you'd expect. Let's listen to some of his remarks.
Fewer than 100 days, this new administration has done so much damage and so much destruction. It's kind of breathtaking it could happen that soon. We can't go on like this as a divided nation, as divided as we are. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time. It's never been this divided. Granted, it's roughly 30%, but it's a 30% that has no heart.
I feel like when President Obama speaks, people want to hear from him. When Biden speaks, do people want to hear as much?
Well, I mean, I think some Democrats look at President Biden as the fact that Trump is in office again as a part of the Biden legacy. The fact that he did not step out of this race sooner to allow for another contender to rise to the top of the ticket, that is a part of the Biden legacy. So it is interesting to hear him come out and speak, him speaking and seemingly referring to Trump supporters as having no heart. But this all comes as the Democratic Party is trying to figure out what its next steps are. And so I also saw something that was really interesting this morning. The DNC's vice chair, David Hogg, he's also a survivor of the Parkland shooting down in Florida at that high school. He has also started a group where he is going to be elevating younger progressive Democrats to challenge Democratic incumbents in safe Democratic.
This is more infighting.
It is, but it's a part of the conversation that Democrats are having as they try to figure out how to reclaim power as we look toward midterms.
From an outsider's point of view, it seems like the Democrats keep having these conversations. Surely they need to find someone who can be a speaker for them and go up against the Trump administration. It doesn't feel like there's any opposition.
There's no standard bearer for the party right now, and I think that's part of what they're trying to figure out.
Avery Harper, what a joy. Lovely to meet you for the first time in person.
Good to meet you too.
Thanks for being here.